Some ruins are just stones, but others whisper all too clearly. The Mayans left behind calendars, temples, and mysteries, and the deeper we go into the jungle, the less we understand. Their pyramids seem older than time. Some symbols point to dates that have not yet come, and certain artifacts simply don't belong to any known era. Were they simply timekeepers, or something more? Today, we're on the trail of 20 Mayan mysteries that archaeology hasn't been able to explain, and history has refused to remember. So stick around. Some secrets aren't buried, they're just waiting. A Mayan object that was intentionally buried. On the Yucatan Peninsula in the Mexican state of Campeche stands Culbacan, an obscure name on the archaeological map of Mesoamerica. Until the early 2000s, only local residents and a few researchers knew about this place. There were no giant staircases like in Chichen Itza, no engravings like in Palenque, until excavations began to uncover things that weren't supposed to be found. The building complex discovered beneath a layer of rock and soil is intact. It's been buried. It was carefully in layers, as if intended to preserve rather than destroy. Inside are the remains of temples, entire flights of stairs, and fragments of walls with preserved plaster. All of this lay under a dense heap of limestone, organic waste, sand, and small ceramics. Layer after layer was laid identically. Tool marks on some blocks indicate work with a clear purpose: concealment. Surprisingly, the dating shows that the filling occurred not after the decline of the civilization, but long before it, the mid-8th century. This time is still considered part of the classical period. Why, at this time, would someone decide to close the complex rather than destroy it? One of the first explanations proposed by researchers was religious. Perhaps something later deemed desecrated took place here. The Maya believed that a space could become unclean if the spirits with whom rituals were performed grew out of control. In such cases, the site was covered over, symbolically closing the portal. But there are no traces of the disaster in Culbacan, no victims, ash, or charred remains. The second explanation is political. Perhaps the ruling elite fell, and a new cult decided to bury the legacy of its predecessors. But here, too, a problem arises. If this had been a political act, the symbols would have been destroyed. But here, on the contrary, they were preserved. They were simply hidden. On the interior walls of the main temple are strange images. Bas-reliefs depict figures resembling humans, but with distorted skull proportions, elongated to the rear, with no signs of the bandaging characteristic of elite Maya. Are seated in poses not found in other regions. Above them are symbols resembling connected stars. One fragment shows what appears to be an object hanging above the pyramid. It resembles a sphere with a broken light. Archaeologists have not provided an official interpretation. Another oddity is the complete absence of bodies. The temple was not used as a tomb. Not a single skeleton, not a single burial near the buried complex. It's as if the city had been abandoned in advance. As if someone knew that this place should not be destroyed but preserved, but in such a way that access to it would be closed for centuries. Too purposeful, too precise. In other places in Mesoamerica, in Nacum, Tonina, and Dos Pilas, partially buried fragments of buildings have also been found. But nowhere else, except at Culbacan, was the complex so neatly encased in its own death. What were these people trying to hide? Whose memory were they trying to push underground? A tomb without a name or entrance. In 1978, in the dense jungles of Petén, Guatemala, a team of archaeologists from the University of San Carlos discovered an unaccounted stone platform at the foot of a hill. It was not listed in the registry, did not match descriptions of Mayan temples, and seemed too simple to be a sanctuary. Clearing revealed it to be the entrance to an underground structure. The rectangular opening leading underground was covered with a carefully fitted limestone slab, its perimeter unmarked. It looked as if it had never been opened. The slab was unmarked. No mascarons, no hieroglyphs, no indication of the owner or deity. This in itself raised questions. The Maya rarely left tombs without names. Every nobleman, every priest sought to immortalize themselves in stone. But here, there was only a smooth surface and a narrow groove along the edges, intended, as it later turned out, for pouring lime mixture. When the slab was partially lifted, a sharp chemical odor was detected in the opening. Inside, it was pitch dark and cold. At the request of the expedition leader at the time, work was suspended until chemical safety specialists arrived. People in the camp began saying that the security system had been activated. Local guides refused to return to the excavation site, claiming that the site was living on its own and the air inside was foreign. A week later, when they returned with the equipment, the slab was lifted again. Inside, there was a tunnel descending at an angle. Its walls are smooth, polished, almost mirror-like. No drawings, no symbols. Only on the right side are strange hemispheres as if set into the stone. They had no function, were not hollow, but reflected the light from the lantern as if their surface were metallic. This is the only time archaeologists in the region have encountered something like this. A passage about 17 meters long led to a massive chamber. But it was empty. No sarcophagus, no urn, no remains. Just one object. A stone pedestal in the center, on which lay a smaller slab. The same limestone, the same smooth surface, and again, no inscriptions. Just a handprint. Human, but with disproportionately long fingers. When archaeologists tried to remove the slab from its pedestal, they felt a slight vibrational tremor. It was neither seismic nor mechanical. It wasn't detectable by instruments, but it literally passed through the skin. Several people complained of headaches, others of severe chills. They didn't go down into the chamber again. The next day, a delegation from the Guatemalan Ministry of Culture and representatives from the Ministry of Defense arrived at the camp. The excavation site was immediately mothballed and sealed under the guise of a cave-in. All photographs taken inside were confiscated. Some archaeologists were sent home. Access to the site remains closed to this day. Officially, it does not exist. There is no tomb under this hill. More than 40 years have passed since then, but a copy of an internal report compiled by an anonymous expedition member is circulating in scientific circles. He claims that the slab with the imprint was later removed and transported to an unknown storage location. Before this, it was photographed at high resolution, and supposedly, when magnified, micro-incisions were discovered on its surface, forming a complex geometric pattern unlike any Mayan script. The drawing resembled a map, or a diagram. Spirals radiating from the center, intersecting lines, nodes inscribed in circles. One theory is that this is a map not of the Earth's surface, but of something intangible. Streams, memory, energy. Nobody knows. Local shamans have preserved a legend about an empty room containing an echo of the first priest who came not from flesh but from light. He was not buried. He simply disappeared. The chamber in the hill. Maybe it's not a tomb. Maybe it's a transition platform, or a place from which no one returns. Maybe they do not open it not because they're afraid of destroying it, but because they're afraid to let it in. A codex that tells of aliens from the sea and sky. In 1976, a previously unknown document surfaced in the private collection of a Mexican diplomat. It was a fragment of a codex, a handwritten scroll written on amatol paper, a traditional material typical of the late Mayan period. The codex was severely damaged by moisture and faded pigment, but some of the images and glyphs remained quite clearly preserved. The document quickly fell into the hands of researchers at the National Institute of Anthropology. It was provisionally designated Codex Itzamna 17. Its form resembled post-classical manuscripts, but it differed in two ways. First, it lacked a traditional narrative structure. Second, its content, which no one could clearly explain. One of the scenes on the surviving portion of the scroll depicted boats approaching the coast. On these boats stood figures in tall headdresses surrounded by a halo. The second scene depicts an object in the sky from which waves of lines descend toward the ground, resembling rays. Below them are figures raising their arms. Between these scenes are symbols not previously seen in any other Mayan codex. According to epigraphers, the text does not contain the names of known gods. It does not relate to the cult of Kukulkan or to the classical myths of the Popol Vuh. He speaks of the arrival of beings named by words that can be translated as those who move through the sky and water. This is not a figure of speech. It is a specific description of the direction of arrival, from above and from the horizon. Even stranger, none of the glyphs representing these creatures have roots in known Mayan dialects. They are classified as neither divine nor human. Their form resembles a fusion of animal features, masks, and mechanical parts. One symbol depicts a face with two pupils in one eye. Another is a creature with arms hanging below the knees and a shield shaped like a star. The codex soon disappeared. According to the official version, it was destroyed in a fire while being transported to the museum's storage facility in Tula. Neither the original nor any authentic copies survived. Only photographs taken during the initial inspection were available. They were only leaked in 1991, when one of the restorers published scans in a private publication in the Yucatec language. It was later discovered that the symbolism in this codex was almost identical to a carving on a slab found in Coelho, Guatemala. It also depicts a celestial object with rays emanating from it and figures standing beneath it. One of them holds an object resembling a book. The second extends her hand toward the object. Some researchers believe this refers to a recorded contact, not with gods in the mythological sense, but with real beings. Appearing simultaneously from both water and sky is a common motif in descriptions of visitations from two directions. Supporters of this version note the coincidence with similar legends of the Aztecs and Toltecs, where strange teachers come from the sea and then disappear into the sky. What is also surprising is that one of the glyphs, which was considered undecipherable, matched in shape the symbol found on ceramics in Ecuador, more than 2,000 kilometers from the Mayan territory. This discovery strengthened suspicions that the information was transmitted over a large spatial range, and therefore could have been part of common knowledge. The main question remains open. If the Maya did indeed record contact, then with whom exactly? And why was this codex not preserved? Who destroyed it and why? History left no answers, only images and symbols that are repeated in different parts of the continent, but nowhere explained. Not a single official expedition has recognized Codex Itzamna 17 as authentic, but neither has it denied its existence. It remained in a gray area, like so much knowledge that doesn't fit into the usual chronology, and which perhaps was kept not for us, but for those who will one day return from the same direction, from the sky, or from the horizon. Temples aligned with other worlds. Among all the ancient structures of the world, Mayan temples stand out not only for their monumentality, but also for their mathematical precision. Some of them were built with such attention to orientation that even the slightest deviation from the axis was excluded. It would seem that all this is for the sake of observing the sun and planets. But in some cases, the alignment occurs not with the sun or the moon, but with points that at first glance make no sense. And it is these points that raise the biggest questions. One such temple is in Yaxchilan, Chiapas. Its central entrance is oriented not to the east, as in most religious buildings, but at an angle of 37 degrees to the northeast. This line does not coincide with the direction of the solstices. It does not indicate the moonrise. But on the day coinciding with the ancient Mayan festival, it precisely coincides with the rising of a certain section of the Pleiades star cluster. And this is not an isolated case. At Tikal, the largest temple complex in Petén, the Temple of the Jaguar, is aligned with the rising of Sirius. This star was revered by the Egyptians but was not central to the classic Maya astronomical system, at least according to official scholarship. So why does it figure in the architectural orientation? Archaeologists long dismissed this as a coincidence. However, in 2010, a team of Mexican astronomers conducted a cross-analysis of 32 surviving temples in the regions of Chiapas, Campeche, and Guatemala. They concluded that more than 20% of them are aligned with stars that played no significant role in the agricultural or calendar cycle. They do not influence the changing of the seasons. They are not associated with the start of sowing or rain rituals. They have no logical function in the calendar, but they are repeated. This led the researchers to conclude that orientation may be symbolic or linked to another level of knowledge. In the temple at Bonampak, images were found showing priests looking not at the sun, but at something in the night sky. One of the frescoes depicts a hemisphere with many dots connected by lines. To the right of it is an altar, on which lies an object resembling a sphere. The most striking thing is that the line from the altar continues onto the adjacent wall and merges into the depiction of a temple. It's as if the architect had pre-built a trajectory connecting the image and the actual architectural axis. This couldn't have been done by accident. In some parts of the Uxmal complex, the central arch is oriented in a direction that coincides with the so-called Orion Nebula, a structure invisible to the naked eye but known in mythology as a gateway between worlds. The Mayans did not have telescopes, but they oriented their temples to points that are barely visible under normal conditions. In 2019, a laser survey of the platform in the city of Etzna was conducted. A computer model showed that the temple complex in the center is aligned to mirror the shape of a star cluster known as the Crab Nebula. It is not visible from Yucatan latitudes for most of the year, but twice a year he appears in the dawn sky for 1 hour. On one of these days, a festival is still held in Etzna, associated with the birth of the god from the heart of the sky. Orientation to the stars is not unique to the Maya. It was used by the Egyptians, Sumerians, and Chinese. But in Mayan culture, it is combined with something else. Not only with alignment, but also with the depiction of beings that came from there. The temples of Palenque and Piedras Negras contain bas reliefs depicting deities descending from the sky, holding strange objects in their hands. One of them resembles a rolled-up cylinder. Another is a disc with 4 circles. These same shapes are repeated on pottery found in Belize. And all this is in the context of rituals associated not with the harvest, but with the opening of the sky. Some scholars offer a cautious explanation. These are all symbols, allegories, elements of myths. But the fact remains. Mayan temples are oriented toward points that are invisible, have no influence on earthly life, and serve no function, unless they are needed by someone else. Perhaps these are not just landmarks. Perhaps these are landmarks for return, or traces of someone who has already come from the other side of the sky. Not human skulls? In 1999, in the Mexican state of Tabasco, in the La Venta region, archaeologists discovered a burial that at first glance appeared ordinary. A group burial of 8 bodies, dated to approximately the 7th century AD. Everything was consistent with Mayan rituals. The bodies were laid out in a precise order. There was jewelry, pottery, and evidence of blood ties. But one of the skeletons raised a few eyebrows. Its skull was pulled back so far that it couldn't be explained by known bandaging methods. The Maya practiced cranial deformation from infancy as a symbol of elite status. The child's head was placed between planks, and over time, the bones were molded into the desired shape. But even in the most extreme cases, the skull retained the proportions of human anatomy. In this case, no. The discovered skull was 40% longer than a human's. Its parietal bone was thickened, and the sutures between the skull bones were partially fused. The frontal bone protruded forward, the eye sockets were shifted closer to the temples, and the back of the head ended in a sharp slope. This structure could not have been the result of cultural practice. It must have been innate. X-rays were taken, and the skull was sent to a lab. Initial analysis revealed that the bone structure was consistent with human bone structure, but with variations not found in the known population. These included an additional supraorbital arch, the absence of a sagittal suture, and small openings at the base of the skull that are not characteristic of Homo sapiens. Some of these features resembled Neanderthal skulls, while others were unique. What did this mean? The first explanation was a mutation. But then it should have been accompanied by other signs: growth and developmental disorders, anatomical abnormalities. There was nothing of the sort. The skeleton looked perfectly harmonious. An adult, apparently, who had lived to be 30 years old. There was a suggestion of inbreeding, but that too was not confirmed. The skull was not part of a genetic defect. It was normal, just different. It later emerged that such finds were not isolated. The archives of the Institute of Anthropology in Mexico City contain a photograph of a skull from Palenque, dating to the 6th century. It is not officially registered, but the image clearly shows its similar shape. In the 1970s, a skull with an identical ridge and asymmetrical eye sockets was discovered in the Caracol region of Belize. At the time, it was dismissed as a ritual mask and was not studied. By 2010, scientific circles began to discuss a distinct phenotype, unclassified by official anthropology. Some scientists cautiously suggested that perhaps a parallel group, or perhaps a variant of the Mayan elite, existed, possessing different genetic characteristics. But not a single DNA test has been published in the public domain. Samples were taken, but the findings were not published. The strangest thing is the symbolism. In the places where these skulls were found, images of creatures with similarly shaped heads were often found on walls and artifacts, but they were not depicted as humans. Their bodies were wrapped in fabric, their faces covered with masks, and only the elongated skull was emphasized as the main feature. One fragment of pottery depicts a creature handing a scroll to a priest. The caption, partially translated, reads, "He who knows before the beginning." This led to yet another version. These creatures weren't Mayans. They existed before them, or alongside them, or perhaps they weren't even human. Proponents of alternative theories point to the similarity of similar skulls in Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt. The elongated head shape, the absence of a sagittal suture, and abnormal bones are all present. And everywhere, they are associated with priesthood, knowledge, and something that later faded from history's view. Skeptics say this is simply an overreaction to cultural practice. But then why are these skulls so rare? Why are most of them unstudied, unclassified, and quickly disappear from public view after discovery? Perhaps it's not the shape that matters, but who it resembles. And perhaps the Mayans didn't just revere those to whom it belonged. They accepted them as not from here. Astronomical mechanism found in Copan. The city of Copan, located in what is now Honduras, has been known since the early 20th century as one of the main astronomical centers of the Mayan civilization. Steles with extraordinary detail of calendar cycles, hieroglyphic staircases with encrypted dating of events hundreds of years in advance, and bas-reliefs depicting celestial bodies with an accuracy that amazes modern researchers were found here. But in 1994, a structure was discovered in Copan that has yet to be definitively explained. During excavations on the eastern edge of the complex, near the Temple of the Sun, part of an underground chamber was uncovered. It was a round hall, about 7 meters in diameter, with walls made of perfectly fitted blocks of volcanic tuff. In the center is a stone slab with carved lines resembling a scale. Along the walls are shelves on which lay stone cylinders of varying heights. Each cylinder was cut at a specific angle and marked with dots reminiscent of Mayan numeric glyphs. Archaeologists assumed the room was used for rituals. However, the configuration of the details forced them to reconsider this theory. The stone cylinders could rotate. The base of the central slab had a notched circular groove. Several archaeologists, in informal notes, have called this structure a stone transmission, as in mechanical devices. But where did the Maya get the idea of a transmission? An examination of the plate showed that when the cylinders were placed in a certain sequence and one of them was rotated, the others were set in motion. It wasn't a device in the modern sense, but it was a system. And most importantly, its behavior corresponded to the cycles of Venus. The Mayans revered Venus as one of the most important objects in their calendar system. They tracked its phases with an accuracy of one day. The theory arose almost immediately. Perhaps the discovered system is a mechanical model of the celestial cycle, allowing one to calculate the phases of Venus, solar eclipses, or other astronomical events. A comparison with the ancient Antikythera mechanism, found in Greece, became obvious. But while the Antikythera device dates back to the 1st century BC and was constructed using metal, here we are dealing with an entirely stone model, created more than 1,000 years before the invention of the gear on the European continent. Skeptics objected, this is not a mechanism, but simply a symbolic reconstruction. But researchers who performed 3D modeling of the structure proved that the shape of the angles, the depth of the notches, and the size ratios correspond to calculations of the periods of Venus, the Moon, and even eclipses. One of the configurations matches the calendar inscribed on Stele E, found in the same complex. The mechanism is not officially recognized as an astronomical instrument. In archaeological reports, it is described as a complex astronomical model, without any details. Its reconstruction has not been exhibited in museums. The cylinders were moved to a closed storage facility, and the entrance to the underground room was sealed due to ground instability. However, in 2007, photographs of the internal structure leaked. One of the cylinders revealed a carving depicting a human eye enclosed in a circle. Surrounding it were rays and symbols reminiscent of a compass. Below the image was a chain of dots, corresponding to the distance between the cycles of Venus and Mars. Some researchers who have studied these materials have made a cautious conclusion. The Maya may have possessed a physical instrument of observation and calculation, built without metals, but with an accuracy exceeding similar devices in other cultures. And if this is true, it means that they had an understanding not only of the symbolism of the heavens, but also of the principles of engineering astronomy. Who built this mechanism? Why was it hidden in an underground chamber, the access to which was deliberately disguised? Why does no later Mayan source mention such constructions? Perhaps because this knowledge wasn't publicly available, passed on only to a small circle of priests. Or perhaps because it didn't originally belong to the Maya. The machine at Copan isn't a symbolic riddle, it's a physical device that remains silent, or perhaps waiting to be activated again. Wall with a record of the collapse of the heavens. Deep within the ruins of the ancient Mayan city of Tonina, in what is now Chiapas, lies a fragment of a wall long thought to be simply decorative masonry. It was partially hidden by rubble and had no distinguishing symbols. But in 1991, after another wave of excavations, this wall became one of the most controversial finds in the history of Mayan culture research. The wall fragment, known today as the Sky Rift Wall, is a complex bas-relief over 4 meters long. The images are executed with extraordinary detail. In the center is what appears to be a celestial dome, bisected by a crack. He's spiraling downward toward the ground, erupt from this crack. Beneath them are figures of people with their hands raised, around whom debris from buildings is flying. Kama archaeologists interpreted this as a scene from mythology. Perhaps it was a reference to an episode of the Popol Vuh, the destruction of the first world by the gods. But several details did not match traditional iconography. Firstly, The crack in the sky is shown as a slit from which emerges not flames or rain, but concentric waves. Secondly, at the bottom is depicted not a demon, but a celestial body falling vertically. And thirdly, next to this scene are carved glyphs indicating a specific date, 6 Kumku, 9 Vinal, 8 Katun. This date, after conversion to the Gregorian calendar, corresponds to approximately 738 AD. According to chronicles, no major natural disasters were recorded during this period. There were no volcanic eruptions, no earthquakes, no wars that could justify destruction on such a large scale. However, the fresco suggests otherwise. It doesn't document a myth. It looks like a testimony. Some independent researchers have proposed a theory about a so-called sky explosion or celestial strike, a rare atmospheric phenomenon in which a meteorite, before reaching the ground, explodes in the atmosphere, causing a powerful shockwave. Modern history knows of such cases. In Tunguska in 1908, a similar explosion toppled trees over an area of over 2,000 square kilometers. In Chelyabinsk in 2013, the shockwave blew out windows in tens of thousands of homes. Could something similar have happened in Central America in the 8th century? If the fresco truly depicts an airburst, it may be the first visual evidence of a meteorite event in human history. Then the images of people with raised hands are not ritual. They represent fear. Then the flying rocks are not symbolism. They are reality. Of microparticles found in the region also supports this theory. In 2015, a team of geologists analyzing soils in the Tanina area discovered an abnormally high content of iridium, an element characteristic of meteorites, in one of the cultural layers. The concentration was not lethal, but significant. It indicates the presence of a substance of extraterrestrial origin. Moreover, the layer dates to the same period as the fresco. Just a coincidence. But why then isn't this event mentioned in other Mayan written sources? Why are there no records and codices or clay tablets? One hypothesis is that this event wasn't considered mythical and wasn't deified. It was too real, and so it was recorded not in words but in images to circumvent priestly censorship, or vice versa. Perhaps the events were so devastating that they tried to erase the memory of them, leaving only as a hint, as a warning, or as a key for those who would understand later. Skeptics consider this theory speculative. However, in 2021, NASA astronomers confirmed that several small-diameter celestial bodies may have passed through the Earth's atmosphere over Central America during the 7th and 8th centuries. One of them, according to the simulated orbit, could have gone off course and burned up upon entering the atmosphere. If even one of these objects entered too low, it explains everything. The waves, the crack, the fear, the destruction. And then this wall is not a symbol, but an archive. Testimony to a catastrophe that happened once and can happen again. Sound codes of Chichen Itza. When the first explorers began systematic excavations at Chichen Itza, their attention was focused on the architecture. The Temple of Kukulkan, also known as El Castillo, quickly became a symbol of the Mayan civilization. Its step pyramid, precise geometry, and complex calendar meaning astonished archaeologists. But much later, it became clear that the most unusual feature of this structure was not its shape, but its sound. In 1998, Mexican architect and engineer Juan Morales first recorded an acoustic phenomenon associated with the temple. He was standing at the base of the pyramid's stairs and accidentally clapped his hands. The answer was a sharp, short sound, as if a response had come from somewhere above. Not an echo, but a modified response. He repeated it, and heard the same thing. The sound resembled a bird's cry, specifically the cry of the quetzal. The Mayans considered this bird an incarnation of the god Kukulkan. It was associated with the sky, rebirth, and the flight of the soul. It was considered a messenger between worlds. When the phenomenon was studied more deeply, it became clear that the steps of the pyramid are designed so that the sound wave, reflecting off the corners of the stairs, is refracted and transformed. This creates a sound similar to the signal of a living being. The closer to the center, the clearer the effect. Such a result could not have been achieved by chance. It required precise calculation of angles, dimensions, and intervals, and most importantly, an understanding of how the wave would behave upon reflection. Morales published a paper in an engineering journal. It was ignored. But then a team of acoustics experts from the University of California visited Chichen Itza. They confirmed, the effect exists. It's not subjective, doesn't depend on temperature or humidity. It's ingrained into the structure. Then they began checking other sites. In the ball court not far from the main temple, there are 2 points, one near the southern wall, the other near the northern wall. The distance between them is about 135 meters. If you whisper at one point, the person on the other side will hear the words clearly, as if they were spoken 2 steps away. The microphones recorded that the sound wave was not dispersed but traveled strictly along the wall. This is so-called surface directional transmission. It is used in modern conference halls and theaters. But how was this achieved without knowledge of modern acoustics? And then there's more. Inside the observatory called El Caracol, as you move along the spiral passage, the sound of your footsteps increases. A person walking along the corridor creates the sensation of many people approaching. The echo is amplified in return. This creates the effect of multiple presence, as if you are not alone. Some researchers believe this is a way to create psychological pressure or accompany a ritual. But others point out that all these effects only work if the source is precisely positioned. If you deviate a meter, the sound disappears. This means the structure was designed for a strictly defined location. For what purpose? The first version is religious. Acoustics were used to enhance the sense of divine presence. Priests created a sound that was perceived as the voice of God. Illusion, magic through science. The second version is communicative. Sound was used as a code, as a way to convey meaning without words. The sound of the Quetzal is not just a bird. It is a sign of transition. The Mayans associated sound with frequencies that opened certain states. Perhaps the pyramid was not only a temple, but also an acoustic device that activated perception. Proponents of the third version go further. They argue that the architecture of Chichen Itza as a whole represents a system that transmits modulated signals. They can't be deciphered with letters, but they influence perception, emotions, and behavior. Like in music, one sequence evokes anxiety, another delight. The Mayans may have possessed knowledge about the influence of sound on the human condition. This is not esoteric. Modern neuroacoustics has proven that certain frequencies induce relaxation, excitement, and even trance states in humans. The Mayans may have used this in ritual, or perhaps in other ways. One day in 2017, a researcher studying the pyramid's acoustics noticed that the effect was amplified during a full moon. The wave became denser, the sound sharper. He repeated the experiment at different lunar phases, and I discovered a pattern. At a certain phase and angle of reflection, a sound is created that replicates the frequency of the human voice. Not a phrase, but the timbre itself, as if someone had built into the building not just a response, but an answer. Is this a coincidence? Or was the sound in these temples not a ritual, but a connection? If so, then in the architecture of Chichen Itza we have not just a temple, but a device. The question is, who was supposed to hear it? And who was supposed to respond? A calendar that tells more than just time. In December 2012, millions of people around the world turned their attention to one date, December 21st. The day the Mayan calendar was supposedly supposed to end. The media reported on the end of the world. Theories circulated online, and ancient astronomy was discussed. But when the day passed and nothing happened, most breathed a sigh of relief and forgot about it. But archaeologists and researchers studying the Mayan civilization have not forgotten, because the end of the calendar in the long count system did not promise the apocalypse. It marked a transition, the completion of one Baktun and the beginning of a new one. It was not an ending, but a reset, a restart of the countdown. And therein lies a deeper meaning. The long count calendar uses a mathematical system based on vigesimal notation. One Baktun is 144,000 days, or approximately 394 years. 13 Baktuns make up a grand cycle that ended in 2012. Everything would be fine, if not for the oddity. The choice of the number 13 has no functional significance. From a mathematical point of view, it is not needed. It is not a multiple, not a basis. It is a symbol. In Mayan mythology, the number 13 was associated with the completion of the cosmic order. The Popol Vuh speaks of 13 heavens and 9 underworlds. 13 is the peak, the point of saturation, from which the cycle returns to the beginning. But there's another peculiarity to the codices dedicated to time. One of the panels in Tortuguero depicts a priest looking to the sky. In his hand is a time glyph, next to which is a second date. Not 2012, but 4,772. This date is the next peak, the completion of the next cycle. It turns out that the Mayans knew not only the end of one circle, but also the structure of the next. They didn't view time as a line. They projected it. In 2011, Archaeologists discovered painted walls in Guatemala containing astronomical tables dating back to the year 7000. These include calculations of eclipses, lunar phases, and the movements of Venus. Incredible, considering they were written over 1,000 years ago. These tables are devoid of emotion. Just numbers, as if someone calculated the model and not just observed. What does this mean? Some believe the Mayan calendar was not only a chronological tool, but also a predictive system. It didn't simply describe the past. It laid out the structure of the future. It didn't contain specific events. There were time nodes at which shifts occurred, and 2012 is one of them. Yes, nothing collapsed, but much has changed since then. Acceleration of global processes, growing technological pressure, a revision of values. Some researchers argue this is the end of Baktun effect. Not destruction, but a reformatting of the field. The calendar's unique feature is that it ignores randomness. It is built on fractal logic, the repetition of patterns. If a transformation occurs in one Baktun, it must be repeated. It's like a musical structure. If the first part is played, the second will be a variation, but on the same rhythm. And now, the main thing. The stele from Koban mentions another cycle. It is not part of the long count system. It is listed separately. The text speaks of the time before the first transition. This phrase appears next to a glyph that researchers call the turn of the shadow. It is not found anywhere else, only there. What is this period? Why is it separate? And why does the glyph look like a spiral inscribed in the human eye? There's a theory that the Mayan calendar describes not only time, but also consciousness. That each phase is not just a date, but a state. Civilization, as a unified field, goes through stages: birth, ascent, overload, disintegration, reunification. Not the end of the world, but a transition of consciousness to a new level. If so, then 2012 wasn't a deception, but a point of activation, the start of a new Baktun, which moves not through the material world, but through the inner one. The Mayans believed that the deepest cycle is not the movement of the sun, but the movement within a person. And then their calendar ends not with time. It ends with forgotten knowledge that was meant to emerge, not externally, but within each person who remembers that it all has already begun. Crystal skulls. The legend of the crystal skulls is one of the most bizarre and enduring stories associated with the Mayan civilization. According to it, in ancient times, there existed 13 skulls carved from solid quartz, each containing knowledge of the past. They were called the memory of the source. According to legend, if all 13 skulls were collected in one place and at the right time, they could convey to humanity the knowledge of the origin and future catastrophes. Many researchers consider this a myth. The problem is that these skulls do physically exist. At least a few of them are documented in museums and private collections. The most famous of these is the Mitchell Hedges skull, discovered in 1924 in Belize. It is crafted from transparent quartz with a precision that still raises questions. Instruments capable of polishing such an object without microcracks or tool marks simply did not exist at the time. When the skull was examined at a Hewlett-Packard laboratory in the 1970s, experts were unable to explain how it was created. Its optical properties indicated that the cutting had occurred against the direction of the crystal axis, which would have resulted in the quartz being destroyed. Nevertheless, it was intact. Its shape was anatomically precise, with a detached lower jaw, perfectly balanced. Other skulls have surfaced in Germany, France, and Mexico. Most have no confirmed dates, but all are made of monolithic quartz. Several bear traces of fine engravings and symbols resembling writing, but undecipherable. One of the skulls was rumored to be kept in a Vatican vault. Another was in a private collection in Japan. The third disappeared from a museum in Guatemala in the early 1990s. According to legend, the skulls are not just artifacts. Each one is associated with a specific civilization or continent. Mayans, Aztecs, Incas, Egyptians, Sumerians, Tibetans. As if we were talking not about local history, but about a global system of knowledge transmission. One skull is one part, and altogether, it is something greater. In 2007, a group of enthusiasts claimed to have collected 7 skulls and performed an activation ritual at a temple in Honduras. No official organization confirmed this, but a year later, 3 participants reported strange changes in perception. One began drawing symbols he had never studied. Another began speaking an unknown language in his sleep. A third claimed to see fragments of memories that were not his. Of course, all this could be considered superstition, but there's a catch. The Mayans themselves left no direct mention of the 13 turtles. Balam manuscript speaks of 13 heads gathered under the light of a star to open the gates between times. The reference is symbolic. But translated from Yucatec, the word used for head can mean both a vessel and a carrier. On the other hand, a fragment of a stele was found in Tikal depicting 13 objects arranged in a circle. In the center is a symbol resembling a solar disk. Some researchers believe that this may be an allegory, but the arrangement of objects in the engraving coincides with a known arrangement of skulls in a U.S. museum compiled from private records. The question is, if these skulls were indeed created by the Mayan civilization, why was their disappearance accompanied by such silence? Has information about them barely appeared in the scientific press since the 2000s? Why do museums no longer mention their origins in their exhibits? There's a theory that the skulls weren't Mayan at all. They were passed down to the Maya by those they called gods, but who were, in fact, sentient guardians. They weren't worshipped, they were listened to, and the skulls were tools, not for sacrifice, but for accessing memory. If this is true, then the question is not where the skulls were made, but what is still written in them, and who exactly are they waiting for to start talking? An unknown Mayan script discovered in 2012. In June 2012, amid the hype surrounding the Mayan calendar and the approaching date of December 21st, an event occurred at the La Corona archaeological complex in northern Guatemala that went largely unreported in the world media. A team of researchers from Tulane University and the Guatemalan Ministry of Culture have discovered a stone slab with glyphs that have no analogs in previously known inscriptions. The slab was located in a ruined sanctuary, partially collapsed and covered with tree roots. 3 rows of hieroglyphs were carved onto the slab's surface, oriented vertically, which is atypical for Mayan writing, which is more often arranged in blocks. But it wasn't the orientation that sparked controversy, but the structure of the symbols themselves. Of the 74 glyphs inscribed on the slab, about half didn't match any catalog of Mayan writing, including those recorded in the Dresden, Madrid, and Paris codices. They did not contain the usual elements: human faces, animals, signs of the times. Instead, they contained geometric shapes, concentric circles, lines converging at a point, and symbols reminiscent of diagrams or charts. The initial decipherments reached a dead end. The glyphs did not follow the syntax of classical writing, did not obey calendar logic, and did not include determinatives. Then the researchers took an unusual step. They handed over the glyph images not to linguists, but to mathematicians. This is where things got weird. One of the mathematicians involved in the analysis noticed that the order of the glyphs followed the logical structure of cyclic sequences known in information theory. That is, the symbols were arranged not as words or phrases, but as input parameters to a formula. This approach proved key. The repeating shapes resembled bitwise patterns, and their relative positions corresponded to binary numbers. When the binary code template was superimposed, 13 blocks of 6 symbols each were obtained. 1 block remained empty. Its position was exactly in the center, and this only strengthened the assumption that this was not text, but a coded structure. Mathematicians have suggested that perhaps what we're looking at isn't writing but an algorithm, or a diagram of a sequence of actions. At this point, computer scientists stepped in. They compared the structure to primitive programming languages. One of the blocks had a repeat, reminiscent of a loop command. Another is a deviation from the mainstream. This suggested that the slab could be a memory device containing an encrypted sequence or serial protocol. But a protocol for what? When archaeologists returned to the symbols, they discovered a strange similarity between one of the glyphs and an ornament on the ceiling of a room in Palenque. There, the symbol was embedded in a composition denoting passage through the 9 gates, which is associated with the soul's journey to the afterlife. The symbol was almost identical. This gave rise to a hypothesis. Perhaps the slab represents a transition map, encrypted in symbols that are unreadable because they are not intended to be read, only activated. In some ancient cultures, Tibetan, Indian, Sumerian, there are texts that are read not for meaning, but for the sound effect. They activate a certain state in the person listening or reciting them. Perhaps the glyphs on the La Corona slab work in the same way, not as a message, but as a memory trigger. One fact supports this. One of the researchers who copied the glyphs by hand later stated that he began to see repeating images in his dreams. He described a sequence of figures, glowing lines, and one detail he had not noticed before, a symbol in the lower right corner that appeared to be carved deeper than the others. An inspection confirmed that one of the symbols was indeed carved 30% deeper. This was the only deviation in the carving. But why? In 2014, after the publication of the initial results, the slab was moved to a closed storage facility under the pretext of safety. Access to it is restricted. No new high-resolution images have been released. The deciphering project has been frozen. There is no final report. Researchers cite a lack of funding. Officially, the slab has no proven value. But there are photographs, and there are copies, and there are symbols that don't fit into language, religion, or architecture. Maybe this isn't a text, but a key to knowledge that is still closed, and to a memory that someone once tried to hold inside a stone. Underground chambers that no one can enter. In 2003, as part of a project to map the underground structures of Mesoamerica, an anomaly was discovered in the area of the Tikal archaeological complex in Guatemala. Using ground-based radar, Vanderbilt University researchers have detected voids beneath one of the platforms previously thought to be fully explored. The voids were rectangular chambers connected by narrow passages. Their depths ranged from 6 to 12 meters. They were oriented strictly according to the cardinal points. The length of the main chamber exceeded 20 meters. Everything pointed to the presence of a well-designed, purposefully constructed underground system. What was strange was something else. No entrance. No tunnels leading to these chambers have been identified, neither external nor internal. The structure appears to be sealed. The only accessible way inside is by excavation from the surface. However, after receiving the data, excavation was prohibited. By order of the Guatemalan Ministry of Culture, the site was officially mothballed for an indefinite period. The explanation is ground instability. However, geologists involved in the first stage refuted this. The platform's foundation is stable, and the sedimentary layers are safe. The research ban went unnoticed. A debate has erupted in the scientific community. Archaeologists working on similar structures have suggested that the underground chambers are unfinished tombs or ritual spaces whose existence was previously unknown. But one of the researchers, speaking on condition of anonymity, gave an independent journalist a copy of an internal report. The report states that one of the chambers has a secondary structure built into the main hall. That is, at the time of its construction, elements from another place were used. Blocks that do not correspond to the known Mayan construction style. The stone differs in composition and was not processed using local techniques. The cutting angle, polishing method, and block shape indicate an earlier or alternative origin. In addition, resonant cavities can be seen in the walls of the chamber. These are narrow, vertical channels extending from the ceiling downwards, ending in spheres. When exposed to sound at a certain frequency, they are supposed to create vibrations. Why? Similar acoustic systems are found in Egyptian underground temples. There, they were associated with altered states of consciousness during rituals. Nothing like this had been found in Mesoamerica before. After the excavation ban was lifted, additional details began to emerge. One of the complex's security guards claimed that sharp temperature fluctuations were recorded at night in the area of the platform where the cameras were located. Several times in the area, lights went out and devices failed to work. There were complaints of headaches, disorientation, and auditory hallucinations. This could be dismissed as superstition. But there is an official document. In 2005, at a conference on underground structures in Quito, archaeologist Fernando Rosales presented a fragment of a report stating that the underground chamber contained an abnormally high level of resonant feedback. This means that for a given sound wave, space amplifies the effect exponentially. What does this mean? Some believe the chambers are not tombs or warehouses. They are devices, platforms for amplifying sound, waves, and perhaps signals. One hypothesis suggests that such spaces could be used for transitional states, between sleep and reality, between life and death. The Maya believed that the soul passes through 9 underworlds. Each is associated with a specific frequency, color, and movement. Perhaps the chambers in Tikal are a physical manifestation of this transition. Why is access to them forbidden? Perhaps because the structure is unstable, or perhaps because it still functions. And those who studied it decided not to take the risk. There's a theory that beneath the platforms are not just rooms but information carriers, that they contain encrypted states, not texts. Fields that, when activated, transmit memories, images, and knowledge. Too bold? But if it were just a tomb, why couldn't it be opened? And if it's not just a stone, but a tool, then the question isn't what it does, but who was supposed to activate it. The boy who spoke Mayan, although he never learned it. In 2016, in a small village near the city of Santa Cruz del Quiche, in the mountainous part of Guatemala, an incident occurred that was initially considered a random anomaly. A 4-year-old boy named Mateo, born to Catholic Quechua parents, suddenly began saying words that no one in his family understood. At first, his parents thought it was just a child's imagination, but the words were clear, with accents and grammatical connections. When the grandmother, who knew the basics of the Yucatec dialect, tried to decipher what was said, she was surprised to discover that the boy was speaking an archaic form of Mayan, long since out of use. He hadn't learned it. No one in the house spoke it. There was no television, no internet access either. My parents didn't teach me the language. It seemed to emerge on its own. It was limited to isolated words. But after a few weeks, Mateo began speaking phrases that, according to linguists from the University of San Carlos, sounded like the invocations of a priest during a ritual. He made long invocations to the Father of Light, using complex constructions indicating the past tense, the plurality of gods, and words denoting solar and lunar cycles. It was impossible to explain this in everyday terms. The boy wasn't simply repeating other people's phrases. He spoke intelligently, answered questions, and used the correct endings and tonality. And the strangest thing was that sometimes he would refer to himself in a different person. When a film crew from an independent research project arrived to see him, Mateo said something that was deciphered as, "I have already led people through the 9th corridor." He couldn't explain what it meant, but he repeated, "I wore a golden disc then." He claimed that he used to live where the river was straight, and the temple was like the ear of God. Archaeologists were intrigued. The description of a straight river and an ear-shaped temple matches the composition of ruins in the Ceibal region, where there is indeed a building shaped like a rounded platform running along the bed of the nearly straight Passion River. This sparked discussion. Is it possible that the boy somehow carried fragments of cultural memory within himself? Is this a form of genetic language transmission? Or is it a more complex structure, a phenomenon known as spontaneous embodied memory? Similar cases have been described in other cultures, in India, Sri Lanka, and Tibet. But for Mesoamerica, they are almost undocumented, and even less so in relation to a lost language. Linguists have tried to explain this in terms of a latent language ability. Perhaps the boy accidentally heard the recordings, absorbed the sounds unconsciously, and then reproduced them. But none of the neighbors spoke this dialect. It hadn't been spoken in the surrounding area for over 70 years. And most importantly, some of the words Mateo spoke are not listed in modern dictionaries. Their meaning was only reconstructed by comparing them with the inscriptions in the Tula Codex. When the boy was shown photographs of ancient temples, he confidently pointed to the image of Palenque. He said, "There I spoke with the one who knew before the rain." Researchers have found no explanation for this. The boy's parents began to fear what was happening. They stopped inviting journalists and stopped communicating with scientists. Filming was prohibited. 2 years later, when Mateo was 6, his ability to speak the archaic language disappeared. He remembered that he had once spoken differently, but he couldn't repeat a single word. It was all gone. This is typical of the phenomenon of past memory. By the age of 6 or 7, it disappears. It's as if an internal mechanism is completing synchronization. Spontaneous knowledge is erased, the personality is consolidated, and the person forgets what they knew but didn't learn. If all this is a coincidence, then it is too precise. If a coincidence, then it is too rare. If memory, then whose? Perhaps we are not dealing with the memory of one person, but with a stream that is sometimes accessible. A stream where phrases, images, knowledge are stored. Not for everyone, but for those who, for some reason, are suddenly able to hear them. A pyramid that echoes the sounds of living beings. In 2004, a team of researchers from Indiana University arrived in the Etzna region of southeastern Mexico to study a little-known temple complex. The Temple of Night attracted attention. A relatively modest pyramid, partially overgrown with vegetation and not featured in popular archaeological reference books. However, during the very first reconnaissance, an incident occurred that became the starting point for an unusual study. One of the scientists, walking along the base of the pyramid, shouted loudly to his colleague. The response was not the usual response or echo, but a sound resembling a double pulse, similar to a short rhythmic cry. This wasn't an acoustic artifact of the usual kind. When they repeated the experiment, they got an identical result, with the same delay, as if the sound was returning from inside the building rather than from outside. Acoustic specialists later joined the analysis. Measurements revealed that the temple's structure has an internal resonant shell operating at frequencies close to 80 to 120 hertz, a range corresponding not only to the human voice, but also to certain sound patterns characteristic of animals, particularly monkeys and large birds. When microphones were placed around the perimeter of the platform, it became clear that sound emitted from one side was reflected with a delay and modulation. But most importantly, the sound was different from the original. In one experiment, the sound of a clap was reproduced as a 3-frequency pulse, reminiscent of breathing. The repeatability of the effect was over 90%. Local residents, long accustomed to the pyramid, reported hearing strange sounds in the area around the temple, especially in the morning. Sometimes it sounds like someone is walking inside. Sometimes it's a low hum. One old man said, "The pyramid calls its own if you're not afraid to listen." The research continued. In certain areas of the temple, the sound wave began to distort in shape, especially if its source was located at a height of 1.2 meters, roughly chest level. That is, the resonance increased when the source matched the person's height. It looked like the architecture's response to a living organism. In 2006, a comparison was made with other pyramids in the region, Uxmal, Chichen Itza, and Labna. None showed such a characteristic sound modulation. Only the temple at Etna did. The effect disappeared if measurements were taken during the rainy season. Perhaps the humidity affected the internal structure of the air in the pyramid's cavities. But the geometry itself remained unchanged. One of the engineers involved in the project noted that the structure of the internal echo resembles a bioacoustic filter. That is, the system only responds to a signal if it is of animal origin. This assumption has not yet been confirmed, but a series of experiments with mechanical sound sources have shown that the pyramid hardly reacts to inorganic sound. What could this mean? There are hypotheses that the building was used not only as a temple, but as a receiver, perhaps for voices, or perhaps for something more. Some scientists have compared the structure of the pyramid to an acoustic matrix, which contains the ability to recognize a signal pattern. This is technical terminology, but in an archaeological context it sounds frightening. It turns out that the pyramid could have been tuned to a certain type of sound, perhaps to a certain voice or creature. Among supporters of alternative versions, there was a suggestion that such structures served as activation points. That is, when a person spoke a certain phrase inside it, the sound triggered a process. Perhaps internal, perhaps external. This has not been proven. But Etna's acoustics remain one of the most anomalous of all Mayan sites. Coincidence? Possibly. But if it is an error, it's too precise. The Temple of Night has still not been fully explored. Its interior chambers have not been opened, and measurements have only been taken from the outside. According to the official version, access inside is restricted due to the risk of collapse. But rumors among the workers say that there really is sound inside the chamber, even when no one is speaking. Maybe it's just a quirk, maybe it's a play of architecture, or maybe someone is still waiting to hear the voice, the very one he was tuned to. A deity that resembles an astronaut. In southeastern Mexico, in the Palenque temple complex, lies a sarcophagus known as the Tomb of Pacal. It became famous for its lid bas-relief, depicting a figure that has been the subject of controversy for over half a century, and not just in the archaeological community. Is officially believed to depict King Pacal, one of the greatest Mayan rulers. He is depicted at the moment of his transition to the afterlife, falling into the mouth of Xibalba, the realm of the dead. However, in the 1960s, Swiss researcher Erich von Däniken proposed a different version. He noted that Pacal's pose, the details around him, and the structure of the composition were too reminiscent of a man in a control cabin. The figure lies at an angle, with bent arms and legs. The nose is covered by a mask similar to a breathing apparatus. The hands touch the panel, and the feet rest on the pedals. A stream resembling a flame emerges from the bottom of the image. On the sides, there are structures similar to elements of technical systems, levers, tubes, connections. At first glance, this sounds like a stretch, but with each new generation of researchers, more questions arise. Around the image are glyphs describing a descent from the sky, the opening of a gate, and movement through the air. One of the glyphs, according to an alternative translation, may mean the body of light in the shell of breath. Many archaeologists consider this interpretation pseudoscientific, but none of them have provided a definitive explanation for why such a unique image appeared only here, and why it is not repeated in other Mayan temples in its classical form. There's another oddity. The sarcophagus is almost a meter taller than a human. It's not designed like a typical tomb, but rather like a container. Solid, unlined, with a lid that fits perfectly at the edges. It contains no grave goods. Only bones, and a bas-relief. No decorations, weapons, ritual vessels, just a figure and something that surrounds it. In 2004, a group of independent researchers from Spain conducted a 3D analysis of the composition. The model showed that the visual lines from Pacal's eyes to the panel matched the viewing angle in the cockpits of modern small aircraft. It could have been a coincidence. But one of the elements at the top of the relief turned out to be geometrically identical to the stabilization system, with cross connections similar to the gyroscope system. A comparison with other Mayan images reveals that no other scene contains such a technical density of detail. Priests and kings are typically depicted with animals, plants, and masks. Mechanical symmetry, geometry, and radiation are evident here. Pottery found near the temple depicts the same figure, only this time standing. Behind her is something resembling an opening door or doors. In her hand is a round object. On the surface of the object is a symbol similar to the glyph, signifying return. If we put all the elements together, the pose, the surroundings, the symbolism, the radiation, the size of the sarcophagus, the isolation of the scene from other images, a version emerges. Perhaps the Mayans were not simply depicting the passage of the soul. Perhaps they preserved the image of the one who came from outside and left it in the most protected point of the temple. Ancient chronicles speak of Kukulkan, a feathered serpent who came from the east, taught people, and then left, promising to return. He is not described as a man. He is called the one who wore a mask that cannot be removed and breathed without breathing. In one of the texts there is a phrase, "He held in his hand an eye that does not see, but knows." The symbolism echoes. Perhaps Pakal's sarcophagus is not a description of the afterlife, but an instruction or a warning or an image of someone they were waiting for, or someone they were watching. Science is not yet ready to accept such versions, but it also cannot explain why a single bas-relief in this form appeared suddenly, without prior tradition, and disappeared without repetition. Coincidence? Or an encrypted history of contact? If the Mayans really did see those who came from the sky, perhaps their god wasn't a metaphor, but a figure they recorded so that we would someday realize we'd already seen him. Just not then, and not in that context. Water that holds memory within itself. At the Mayan complex of Yaxay near Campeche, there is a site long avoided not only by tourists but also by researchers themselves. It is a small, submerged structure next to a destroyed platform. Unlike other cenotes, revered as sources of water and sacrifice, this site was not featured on maps or in studies for a long time. It was designated simply as a water depression without ritual significance. It was only in 2008 that archaeologists surveying the area discovered something strange. The water inside this hole remained perfectly calm even in the wind. The surface did not tremble. The water didn't react to the movement of air or reflect light in the usual way. Stones thrown into it didn't create the usual ripples. Instead, there was a single brief splash and an instantaneous fade. The phenomenon was attributed to natural phenomena until a young restorer approached the object and spoke a few words out loud. In response, a sound came from beneath the water. Quiet, muffled, like a short response. At first they thought it was a coincidence, but they repeated the experiment and got the same result. From that moment on, the study of the object began. Microphones were lowered into it, its density was measured, and the composition of the water was studied. Chemical analysis showed that the water was no different from other springs in the region. But acoustics are different. Sound remains inside even if the source is short-lived. Some sounds return after a second, others after 3, but with distortion. A similar effect is observed in artificial resonators, but here there was no dome, no architecture, only a vertical well lined with blocks, descending 11 meters. Deeper down lies impenetrable silt. At the bottom lies an unknown, flat base. No inscriptions, no artifacts. Only silence, which occasionally responds. Independent acousticians were invited. They confirmed. The object accumulates sound energy and returns it modulated. Moreover, the distorted waves have a structure similar to speech, but unrecognizable. This is not an echo. It is a reproduction. Then they did the following. They spoke a phrase in the Yucatec dialect, a simple greeting. The response came back within 2 seconds. It wasn't an exact copy, but the rhythm matched. Repeating the experiment with a different phrase yielded a different result. It seemed the system was detecting the signal. This meant it wasn't simply reflecting the sound. It was working with it. Some have proposed the hypothesis that the object is a kind of memory resonator, that the structure of the stone and water allows for the storage of auditory information. And not just storage, but the ability to retrieve it at a specific moment. Perhaps only for those who know what to look for. In 2010, a researcher lowered an ancient ceramic tube used in rituals into the water. After a series of sound pulses were produced, a vibration-like response appeared in the water. The waves went not upwards but inwards, as if the water absorbed the sound and conducted it further, beyond the dimensions. Locals believe this place was a ritual entrance to the afterlife. According to legend, the priest spoke to the spirits not through sacrifice, but through water. He asked questions, and if he answered, the water remained calm. If not, it became cloudy. There are no signs of violence inside this cenote. No bones, no gold. This is not a sacrificial place. This is a conversational space. Official archaeology ignored the results of the acoustic study. The reports labeled the site as a natural spring with no functional significance. But the footage remains. The sound recordings, too. Some of them transmit barely audible signals like a rhythmic, guttural response. No digital noise suppressor could completely clean them up, perhaps because there is no speech in them. There is a state. If the Mayans used water not only for drinking but also as a conductor, then we are not talking about religion, but about technology. The transmission not of information, but of consciousness, mood, memory. Perhaps this cenote is not just a water reservoir, but an archive, but not a literal one, not a visual one, but an auditory one. A temple that preserves only what cannot be read, but can be heard, if you ask the right question out loud. A Mayan vault sealed from the inside. In 1987, at the Mayan city of Calakmul, a group of Mexican archaeologists stumbled upon a strange anomaly in ground-penetrating radar data. One of the temples, partially destroyed and covered with trees, had a closed cavity underneath, identical in size to the other ritual halls but with no visible entrance. This didn't seem unusual until opening the western wall revealed something no one expected. Behind the stone wall was a chamber, an octagonal room lined with smooth limestone. There were no decorations, paintings, or religious objects inside. There is only a stone bench along one wall and a figure of a man sitting directly in front of it, leaning his back against the entrance. He was mummified. The skeleton is in a sitting position, legs crossed, arms on the chest. The skull is slightly tilted forward. Judging by the surroundings, he was not buried. He sat there as if alive, not in a sarcophagus, not under a layer of earth, but against the wall, facing into the chamber. At first, this was mistaken for an act of sacrifice or punishment, but upon closer examination, it became clear that the chamber was locked from the inside. The stones in the doorway were placed on the side where the skeleton was located. This meant that the last person in this room had sealed himself inside. Fluid used for insulation were found. A mixture of lime, chucka tree sap, and obsidian powder is a typical mixture for durable sealing in ritual structures. The composition is fresh with no signs of repeated storage. This means the sealing occurred while the occupant was still alive. What compelled a person to seal themselves forever in a stone cell, with no escape, no food, no water? A line was found carved into the wall behind him, thin, like a cut. It ran vertically and ended in a dot. No inscriptions, no symbols, just a line and a dot. Archaeologists had no idea other than the assumption that it was an individual symbol or an element of some lost cult. The bones were analyzed. Male, approximately 45 years old, with high bone density. The teeth were almost completely preserved. There were no signs of injury or disease. The shape of the skull indicated belonging to the priestly caste. Strong elongation, characteristic of elite bloodlines. A distinctive feature is the absence of a sagittal suture, which is extremely rare. Its absence usually indicates a congenital anomaly or a different anthropological type. When the skeleton was removed and sent for analysis, the chamber began to gradually collapse. First, one of the walls collapsed, then the roof. The cause was a depressurization. The chamber was held in place solely by internal pressure and its structure. Without a figure inside, it would lose its balance. Based on the chamber's design, archaeologists have proposed a theory. The structure may have functioned as a resonator. The volume, proportions, and shape of the ceiling's cross-sections created a standing wave effect. Whispers could be heard in the center of the chamber, even at the lowest volume. If a person spent time inside in silence, they could hear their own breathing, increasing in volume with each passing second. This could have been either torture or a technique for inducing an altered state. But why? Some believed it was voluntary isolation. Mayan texts mention those who went into the earth to connect with what was beneath it. This is not death. This is a transformation. A transition into a form accessible to the world after this. Perhaps the person in the cell did not die in the usual sense, but became part of the structure. According to local community legend, the temples that are sealed from the inside are inhabited not by a spirit, but by a memory. It doesn't live, doesn't speak, but can be felt. When approaching the camera's location, instruments recorded a deviation in the electromagnetic field. The readings were low but stable, at levels seen in underground tombs in Egypt or in fields with residual static in Africa. When archaeologists attempted to restore the chamber in 2012, they encountered something inexplicable. The material used for the rebuilding began to deteriorate even before it was completed. The stones became damp and weakened as if the structure had never been touched. Work was stopped. The site was closed again. The figure was returned to the archive. The camera was lost. No other temple displays the same layout. No skeleton has been found in a similar pose. He was alone. He went inside, not to die, but to stay. Inside the wall that remembered his breath, and perhaps would repeat it if someone sat on the same bench again. Parallel myths found in distant cultures. The more Mayan mythology is studied, the clearer it becomes. Some elements of their cosmogony, images of gods and key symbols, are almost identical to other ancient cultures. Sometimes on another continent, sometimes thousands of years before or after the supposed dates. The Popol Vuh, the main Mayan cosmogonic book, tells how the world was created by the scribe gods. It tells how humans were created from corn dough, and how before them there were other races, made of clay, wood, and dust. All of them were destroyed, because they couldn't see the gods, or they forgot who gave them form. A very similar myth is told in the Sumerian Enuma Elish, where the first humans are created from clay, but prove weak. They fail to cope with the task and are replaced. Both myths echo the theme. Man is the product not of chance birth, but of experimentation. The first is unsuccessful, the second too, and only the third becomes permanent. In the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, known as the Book of the Dead, the soul undergoes a series of trials. It hears voices, sees illusions, and only a conscious being can distinguish the real from the mind created. In the Mayan tradition, after death, the soul descends to Xibalba, the afterlife, which passes through 9 levels. Each level presents a test, an image, and fear. Escape is possible only with a clear mind. 9 levels, 9 illusions, 9 gates. Both texts feature the number 9 as a structure for purifying consciousness. Neither culture was directly connected. Tibet and Mesoamerica are separated by oceans and millennia, but the number is repeated. The meaning is 2. In Egypt, the pyramid texts say that after death the pharaoh must pass through gates, each of which has a name and a guard. In the Popol Vuh, the twin heroes Hunahpu and Expelank also pass through halls guarded by the gods. Among them are the House of Cold, the House of Darkness, and the House of the Jaguar. Only those who do not succumb to fear pass through. Why do myths born in isolation duplicate each other? The motif of the Great Flood appears among the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Sumerians, and the Bible. The cause is always the same: the wrath of the gods, disappointment in humanity, a reset. This is followed by a recreation, and the beginning of a new cycle. Even time in these cultures is not a line, but a circle. Some believe that this is a universal structure of thinking, that people tend to create the same myths. But it's not just the images that are repeated. Details are repeated. Being kneeling before a priest was discovered in a temple in Copan. On its chest is a symbol resembling an ankh, the Egyptian symbol of life. In China, the annals of the Shang dynasty mention a celestial being who gives the king a snake-like staff that can make sound. The Maya depict the god Kukulkan with a similar object that emits light and sound. Even myths about knowledge being brought from heaven are found everywhere. The Dogon in Africa, the Navajo in North America, and the Hindus associate him with the Vedic deity Vishnu, who descended in a ship. The Maya believed that Kukulkan came from the sea, gave them language, counting, and order, and then returned to the stars. The common theme is that knowledge is obtained from outside, and not in the form of random inspiration, but in the form of instructions. The setting of a language, a calendar, a ritual, not a religion, a system, not faith, engineering. The substitution of concepts began later, when the essence began to slip away. Maybe all these myths are one story, retold in different languages, changed by culture, but with the same foundation. And if so, then they do not explain the past. They warn about the future, because the cycle repeats itself. Because man again forgets who gave him voice and form. The Maya were not alone. Their knowledge was not unique. It passed through many cultures, leaving the same traces, sometimes through images, sometimes through numbers, sometimes through the silence between the lines. Maybe a myth isn't fiction, but a coded memory, and every repetition is an attempt to remember. Rituals that no one understands. Of the dozens of scenes depicted on Mayan murals, reliefs, and ceramics, most are decipherable. Sacrifices, harvest ceremonies, meetings of rulers, scenes of the afterlife, all are framed by familiar glyphs and contexts. But in one of Bonampac's structures, in a room known as the Third Chamber of Paintings, a ritual is depicted that has been controversial for over half a century. No scholar has provided a definitive explanation for it. On the northern wall of this chamber are depicted several people standing in a circle. Their heads are covered with hoods, and their clothing is unsymbolic. Their faces are expressionless. In their hands, they hold elongated objects resembling either sticks or tools. One of them, standing in the center, leans forward and extends his hand toward a low stone table. On the table is neither a sacrifice nor food. Instead, it is something round, smooth, and unadorned. No blood, no animals, no altars. The fresco is surrounded by spirals extending upwards. Small figures, not human, are inscribed within them. Elongated skulls, thin bodies, long fingers. Not a single glyph in this scene has been deciphered. They don't correspond to any of the 800 known symbols of the classical Mayan language. Even the writing form is non-standard. The symbols are arranged in a spiral, not in a linear matrix. At first, the scene was considered an artistic license, perhaps a fantasy. But comparison with other images revealed that such a composition exists nowhere else. Neither in the Mayan world nor beyond. It is unique and defies classification. In 1993, a team of anthropologists from Cambridge attempted to interpret the scene as a ritual of remembrance. Perhaps the figures were participants in a ceremony calling on ancestors. But why such unusual bodies? Why are the symbols resembling stars arranged vertically? Why is there no central god? In 2001, a hypothesis was proposed. The scene depicts not a Mayan ritual, but something seen in a dream or trance. Perhaps a priest, having taken hallucinogens, recorded his vision. If so, the fresco is a visualization of an altered state of consciousness. But even this version doesn't explain the shapes of the objects. In the center of the composition on the wall is a figure covered in a lattice pattern, elongated upward. It cannot be classified as an animal or a spirit. It is geometric. The man next to her holds an object resembling a mirror or a disc. He points it not toward the object, but upward, toward the star spiral. Too many things don't fit. One researcher suggested that this is a rite of communication, not with a god, but with some observing intelligence. Perhaps the fresco records an attempt at contact. The object in the center is not a sacrifice, but an interface. The figures around are not priests, but intermediaries, or witnesses. Regional folklore hints at something similar. Legends of Kukulkan mention a ceremony during which no words were spoken. People stood in silence and waited for a sign from the sky. If a sign came, they left gifts and departed. If not, the ceremony was considered invalid. Perhaps the scene in Bonampak is a visual record of such an attempt. But why this format? Why is everything depicted in code that no one can read? There's a theory that this ritual wasn't intended for people. It was addressed to those who could interpret form, not sound. The scene might have been written, not for posterity, but for those who were destined to return. Not a text, but an image. Not a message, but a request. This fresco is not destroyed, not damaged, not worn away by time. It is almost completely preserved, as if it was preserved. Carefully, deliberately, the walls around are reinforced. The place is closed off from direct sunlight. Locals still do not take tourists there. They say it is restless. In official catalogs, the scene is presented as an unknown ritual with elements of abstract symbolism. There is no publicly available analysis, no attempt at digital reconstruction, only hand-drawn sketches made in the 1960s and a few low-quality photographs. Too much unknown, too deliberately inaccessible. Perhaps we are looking at a scene that was not meant to be understood, but only discovered, and activated when the right moment comes. When someone comes who will understand that what is depicted is not a process, but a signal. The disappearance corresponds to the prophecy. In 1983, a small settlement on the border of the states of Chiapas and Tabasco, known as Taxac, lost contact with the outside world. It was a poor, remote village of about 80 people, descendants of Mayan peoples who spoke Choltila. Contact with them was maintained sporadically. Once a month, a government inspector came to inspect the schools and the medical center. That year, the inspector was unable to get to the village for 2 months in a row due to seasonal landslides. When he finally reached Taxac in July 1983, he found no one. All the houses were still there. Food remained on the tables, water in clay jugs, and the animals untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of panic. It looked as if people had simply gotten up and left, leaving their daily lives untouched. Money, clothes, documents remained untouched. Even the lamps were filled with oil. They didn't disappear one by one. They all disappeared. The police and army conducted a search within a 20-kilometer radius. There were no signs of migration, no bodies, no destroyed trails. Not a single surveillance camera, not a single resident of neighboring settlements saw anything suspicious. Takshak's people seemed to have vanished. A few weeks later, local newspapers began to report a story about religious self-disappearances. Allegedly, the village practiced a secret cult, and the people had abandoned the world, entering the jungle for a ritual disappearance. But not a single witness confirmed this. Residents of neighboring villages described the people of Takshak as ordinary, quiet, and devoid of religious extremism. No sects, no sermons, just the language of their ancestors, music, and a quiet life. 2 years later, in 1985, an archaeologist working in Piedras Negras uncovered an ancient text carved on a slab found near the tomb of the middle priest. This text had previously been partially deciphered, but now a phrase matching the description of the events was found within it. The text read, "On the border between two forests, on the day of the transition, the breath of the village will fall silent. Those who have walked in circles 9 times will depart on the day of the mirror and leave everything behind. In this world, they will remain as a trace, but not as a shadow." The phrase sounded allegorical, but the date encoded in the text coincided with July 1983, according to the Mayan calendar. The mirror symbol denoted a lunar day, precisely coinciding with the night before the disappearance. And the 9 references to a circle may refer to the 9 ritual cyclones in Mayan cosmology. A coincidence, maybe, but the archaeologist also found something else. On the same section of the wall, a series of dots was carved. 80 in total. This corresponds to the number of inhabitants of the vanished Takshak. When they tried to publish this information, the archaeologist was politely advised not to report such coincidences to the press. The foundation sponsoring his excavations stopped funding. The report was accepted but published in an abridged form. The phrase about the village's breathing disappeared from the text of the publication. Over the years, Takshak was forgotten. Maps no longer show it as an active settlement. The power line leading to it was dismantled. All that remained were ruined houses overgrown with vines, a few school report cards, and handwritten entries from the inspector's diary. Local elders say that songs on Old Choltil can sometimes be heard in this area, that the smell of a fire can be smelled from there at night, that animals avoid this area. Official science is not commenting on these claims. The reports say the settlement abandoned the area without notice. The people moved away, but no one saw them again. This is how stories that don't fit into archaeological protocols end. They are written off as coincidences, folklore, and fantasy. But when an ancient text describes an event that occurred in our time, and does so more accurately than modern analysis, it is more than a myth. Takshak has disappeared, and perhaps not the first. Perhaps this is what the departure of those who know when the next transition comes looks like. Those who go not backwards, but inward, along the line drawn centuries ago. We know what temples look like. We've studied the calendar. We've deciphered the writing. We've reconstructed cities, traced trade routes, recreated clothing, diet, and even architectural geometry. But all of this is form. The content still eludes us. The Maya left behind a structure, but not an explanation. They sealed their knowledge in codes, symbols, and sometimes in silence. Some things they hid, some they left open, and some were perhaps not intended for us. The 20 secrets we've collected aren't proofs. They're points where logic breaks down, where knowledge isn't explained by development but rather conveyed, where architecture leads the eye to the sky, sound to silence, and text into a spiral. Perhaps we're not dealing with a culture, but with a fragment of something larger, with one level of memory seeped into stone, water, words. The question remains the same. Did the Mayans invent all this? Or did they simply remember what others knew?